Hello, everybody. Welcome to our March 2021 webinar. I'm Addison Snell with Intersect 360 Research. The main focus of our webinar today is going to be to go through some of the data and insights from our recently completed technology survey, our annual technology survey on all kinds of technologies for high performance computing and also AI. This is a continuation of what's been known for the past decade and more as our site census survey, our HPC site census survey. There have been a lot of changes going on in HPC, including AI, and we made some updates to that methodology going into this year so that we could focus in on areas of particular interest to our clients, and we're delighted to present some of those to you here today. In terms of an agenda for today, the first news that we've got is that it's a big week for us at Intersect 360 Research, not only with this announcement, but we're going to be introducing a new Chief Research Officer as an addition to our team, and that's Dan Olds. And I'll come back to that in just a moment to welcome Dan. Then we'll get into highlights from our HPC and AI technology survey. Dan is going to lead a lot of that. Dan was really the driving force behind the scenes of that survey. We're going to look at everything touching these cluster configurations, leading server vendors, processing elements, storage configurations, interconnects, liquid cooling. There's a lot more that's in that. We're not going to be able to present all of that data. The full data set is going to our clients, of course, and is open for additional inquiry. Of course, we're also still looking very closely at cloud computing for HPC and AI in all of its different forms, and that will continue in our budget map survey that's about to hit the field. As well as the ongoing detailed effects of COVID-19, which are being built into our market methodology and forecast. We introduced last summer, of course, a revised 5-year forecast that included our projected effects of COVID-19. We will be checking in on that HPC forecast model. We're not quite ready yet to close the books on 2020. We still need to do the supply side analysis and get the budget map data in before we release our annual market model and forecast. We typically do that in May of each year with early inquiry for our clients in April. So now is the time when we're really working hard on that. But we'll be able to we use the data that we have to do a quick check-in on that and see what it looks like. We'll talk about what's coming up next for us, and we'll have time within this webinar to do Q&A. So getting from that to our first news, introducing Dan Olds. I'm really excited to have Dan joining the team. We're now in our 15th year at Intersect 360 Research, and this is the title, Chief Research Officer, that was held throughout most of that time by our co-founder, Chris Willard, who still remains in the background as an advisor emeritus. But Chris retired, as many of you know, not long ago. And then we were slow to rehire this position specifically because of the pandemic, and also because we had to get exactly the right person. It is not easy to find someone who's a triple threat, who can work the data, knows how to do market research from a data perspective, who's a strong and prolific writer, and who's a good presenter. Finding all three of those skills is nice to have in an analyst. Dan Olds is more of the baseball, the analyst equivalent of a baseball 5-tool player. In addition to those 3 tools, he's great from a business overview perspective. He's a good business strategist, which is a huge asset for our own company, but especially for our clients who want those business insights that get driven by our market research. And then as an extra bonus, he's someone who's already really well known in terms of developing the HPC community through his work with the student cluster competition and bringing in young people into HPC, which has been a perennial issue that we've discussed throughout my entire career as an analyst. That's something I've been talking about. Dan Olds is someone who does something about that. I am really thrilled to introduce Dan Olds. Dan, welcome to the Intersect 360 Research team.
Well, thank you so much, Addison. This is a fantastic opportunity for me. And I think given that introduction, I do need to add that I was never able to hit the curveball, not reliably. And I should probably just sign off now on that high point. But no, I'm fired up. I want to keep going on, and I am ready to jump into this data.
Dan and I have already, you and I have already interacted on a lot of things, in particular around the ISC conference every year. I've been in one of the vendor show, what are the vendor showdown
That's
panels.
right.
You've been in the other. We've been the co-conspirators on the moderation of those. That's always a lot of fun.
The grilling of the vendors.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that.
And I've always loved the insights that you've brought to that as well. I've respected you as an analyst in this space for a long time. So getting you in here as a chief research officer, that's really going to be great for me, and even better, it's great for our clients.
And I've been following you and loving your stuff for the past decade. Oh, wait a minute, you've been around 15 years. Okay, so then for the past 15 years, not just the past decade, but I really respect what you do. And as a erstwhile competitor at one time, the thing is, you do it right. And I always respected that. And I'm so happy to be a part of this.
Thanks for coming aboard, Dan. This is going to be great news for us, great news for our clients. And our clients, if you didn't already know, you're actually probably already gotten some of Dan's work. Dan is someone we could always go to behind the scenes when we needed an extra hand on projects. And Dan, you were the driving force on this survey that we're about to give an overview of.
Yes.
So I'm going to turn the reins over to you and let you do the bulk of the presentation here, because really you were the main guy on all of this analysis. So I'm going to put the slides back up, and I'll keep driving them from my machine. But why don't you take it away on the presentation?
I have been jamming caffeine for the past 3 hours in anticipation of this, so I am ready. Let's jump to the next slide. And the survey, we did it in December of 2020. We had a great, as you're going to see by the demographics in the next couple of slides, we have a great survey base on this. Total of 268 different organizations. We have them broken down by commercial, academic, and government segments, and we can do deep dives based on that for clients. Primarily, we're focusing on advanced technologies, liquid cooling, interconnects, accelerated computing, HPC in the cloud. We're also looking at storage usage and purchase models. We've asked some new questions on that I don't think anybody has seen before. And of course, we have to address COVID and see how that is impacting end user operations, budget, purchase decisions, etc. What you're going to see in the next hour is about 10 to 15% of the data yielded by the survey. There is a lot of data in this one, and please let us know if you'd like full access. So let's hit the demographics first of all. Take a look at the left-hand side. 98% of the respondents are involved deeply with HPC. We only had 2% that said that they're not involved in admin or usage of systems, which is great. I'm really happy with this survey population. And then look at purchasing responsibility. 94% have some impact, some role in the purchase of HPC systems, software, etc., which is, again, a really good demographic. Geographic location, primarily North America. We do have a good chunk of EMEA and Asia Pacific and some Latin America. Organization type, primarily academic, but we also have a good slug of commercial and government as well.
I'll just make a quick comment with regard to the demographics. It's typical that surveys return heavy from academia. Overall, a little more than half of spending comes from commercial markets. So when we take data like this and rebalance it for our market models, that's exactly what we're doing. We take a look at academia as a relevant percentage of the market. The bigger thing that I love seeing on this is the geographic representation around the world on this, that we get substantial surveys from EMEA, Asia Pacific, Latin America that really go along with this. So we feel like we can make really good extrapolations on the market from data like this.
Okay, let's drive on. This is an impressive number. I'm going to jump to the end here. 1.5 billion in purchasing power is represented by these folks. And we have a range, only 9% of the smallest HPC shops with budgets of 100,000 or less, but 45% are 1 million to 10 million, and that's a pretty good sweet spot to be in. but 1.5 billion in purchasing power. So let's take a
All
look
right, what I
at,
meant to say on
yeah,
this one
jump
is
in.
it's important to get those smaller ones too, though, because we get
Yes,
a lot of inquiries from our clients about addressing entry level and mid range. So I like that we have that data in there as well.
very good. So let's start to dive into the data itself again. This isn't going to surprise anybody, but about 98% of the HPC data centers out there are using Intel x86 processors, which essentially rounds to 100%. What's good is that there is some diversity out there. AMD is appearing at about 70% of the surveyed sites, and they're stronger in the commercial sector than in government or in academia. We're also starting to see some ARM powers out there, and then other, which are more specialized processors. Looking at from the vendor side, Dell is continuing to hold a lead over everybody else in the sites that we surveyed. HPE and Cray are there as well. What is interesting is that we put NVIDIA in there as a server vendor to kind of test the perceptions of the market. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, that 30% see or perceive NVIDIA as a server vendor, which I can kind of agree with. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they are. But you have any thoughts on that, Addison?
I do. And NVIDIA is increasingly becoming more of a systems provider through DGX and their HGX reference architectures. Now, NVIDIA doesn't sell them directly. So that's something we continue to monitor, because in our market share models, we assign the revenue to the final seller. So if that's going through a Super Micro or Dell or
Business
an
partner, some
ODM
other
of some
business partner.
sort, the revenue should go there. But what we're looking at here in the survey is essentially the end user perceptions. Now, while we're on that talking about it, Dell and HPE are still really the top main server vendors there. But this continues a trend where in survey after survey, Dell typically outpaces HPE in terms of the number of people in our surveys who say that they have Dell. Now, overall, the HPE systems tend to be larger.
Yeah.
So that's where, when we get to market share and doing things based on revenue, HPE comes out. Also, Dell does very well in academia relative to HPE. And like we just said, academics return a lot of surveys. So that also boosts Dell's presence. But by the time you rebalance this for revenue, again and again, there is not a big gap between HPE and Dell at the top of the market. That's been very close for number one over and over again. That's driven by our surveys. And now, as you said, in our 15th year, this has been consistent for a long time. Going back to the comments on the CPU usage, you mentioned that AMD was doing better in the commercial sector. That's true. And that's also true of ARM. It's interesting. You tend to think of the academic market as being the one that wants to test a lot of new technologies very quickly. Here, it's the commercial markets where we're seeing them really spreading out to test a lot of different types of processing elements. That's AMD and ARM kind of on the way up and Power kind of on the way down right now.
Agree. Yes. This is a really interesting question. I like how we did this. We're getting after number of clusters, but the cluster size that they have, and breaking it down how we do it. Intersect 360, entry-level systems, 16 nodes or less, how many they have. 59% had at least one or up to 10, 11% had 10 or more. Mid-range HPC systems, half of them had 1 to 10, and that's 17 to 64 nodes. We have 13% with 10 or more, and quite a big slug of high-end HPC systems with more than half, 55%, saying that they have at least 1 to 10, 6% saying they have 10 or more. And we got some supers in there too, with 30% saying they have 1 to 10 systems with more than 512 nodes. Now, the industrial customers typically tend to use the mid-range systems, which is 17 to 64 nodes, not exclusively, but again, the bulk of them are. Government and academia typically have the larger high-end systems that we've seen in this survey, and this data really helps complete the market models for us.
Yeah, and what I'll add about that is just to amplify that bottom line on this. There's been an ongoing dynamic in HPC, which we've continued to describe, but this will give us the best survey data we've had on it in terms of describing. All right, people like to see how much of the market is entry level, mid range, high end, and supercomputer, and that's great. But what gets lost a lot of the time is that a high-end or supercomputing class of user also buys entry-level and mid-range systems. And from time to time, it's worthwhile for us to model out what percent of the market is driven by an entry-level or mid-range user as defined by that's the largest thing that they have. They don't also have
Yes.
a high-end system or a supercomputer. And we've done this before, but this is the most detailed we've surveyed it, and we're looking forward to refining our market models in this in terms of giving our clients guidance on addressing the entry level and mid-range portion of the market.
And with this, we're able to isolate those folks, I think like what Addison was saying, that have 16 nodes or less, and take a look at their vendor preferences, take a look at their hardware preferences, and how they're building their systems. So we can cut all of this data just by those, for instance.
Yep.
Driving on. Liquid cooling, a very important topic, and it's growing. We're seeing that 26% have at least some liquid cooling, and an additional 16% have widespread liquid cooling. What's interesting and not surprising is that door chillers are pretty common now. But what is surprising is that they could be passed by fully plumbed racks. We're seeing a lot of that, and I've seen a lot of that in this survey, typically in the very large organizations. And we're tracking individually future and current usage of like system chillers, immersed systems, etc.
Yeah,
So
we
we're
had all
getting
those
deeper into
different
this.
categories. We had all those different categories in this survey, and the door chillers, the chillers attached to the doors, are pretty close with the facility, the data center level plumbing right now. But it's that
Yeah.
data center level plumbing that's growing the fastest. So I expect if we redo this survey next year, we might see that trend continue. Put the fully plumbed category up on top. This is the first time we've surveyed this in this level of detail.
Excellent. Cluster interconnects. You love them. You got to have them. So who's ahead in the ball game right now in the horse race? Ethernet. 40 gigs and under is still the predominant, but they're splitting the market with InfiniBand. It's pretty close for future. Well, InfiniBand is preferred for the higher speed stuff right now. For future use, InfiniBand has significantly more enthusiasm behind it than Ethernet or the proprietary. Interesting to point out, OmniPath has a base to build on for Cornelis Networks, who recently was spun out from Intel. And I've heard some interesting things about OmniPath 2 from them, and I think that's a space to watch. We did also measure the proprietary interconnects, HPE Slingshot, Tofu, BXI, by the same way with current use and future plans. So compute accelerators. This is a big topic. Again, not a surprise here. NVIDIA is leading the race by a solid margin with A100s, V100s, but then other NVIDIA, which could include something like K80s or GeForce gaming GPUs, but also cases where the respondent just didn't know what model they were using. But NVIDIA has a pretty solid lead. We do see some presence for AMD Instinct GPUs, and good presence. Well, what do I want to say here, NVIDIA, Addison? I think it's opportunities, like you said in here, opportunities are expanding for FPGAs. If you total up the Intel FPGAs, Xilinx, that's a decent sized presence in the market. And there are some other more specialized accelerators that we also measured. We also asked about accelerators per node and how they're attached to the system. Don't really have time to go into it here, but that is some very interesting data, particularly on accelerators per node. Hint, it's more than you think.
Yeah, that's been going up. And this is an area where we could really do a separate 1 hour webinar
Mm-hmm.
just on this topic and the data that we have here and the trends that we're seeing in HPC and AI with respect to accelerators and how they're connected to the systems. And I like how you broke this down. With respect to the FPGAs, the big thing is that FPGAs are also growing in the market, not to the extent that NVIDIA has with GPUs, but FPGAs have been around for decades in this space. And what we always noticed was that they were in a different quadrant, if you will, of the market, where FPGAs had a toehold already before GPUs burst onto the scene, was in very highly scalable systems, and especially with things that were text or integer based. They did very well in things like certain categories of the biosciences space. You remember Starbridge would show their Smith-Waterman benchmarks all the time. They did very well there. We would see them in finance, which is fixed point arithmetic, which is closer to integer arithmetic than it is to floating point.
Then also digital signal processing,
digital
DoD
signal
stuff.
processing, another application. Search was another application where we'd see FPGAs, and all at the very high end of the market. GPU growth has come starting from the low end of the market. It really started with people launching up from the workstations and for things that were floating point intensive. So all the growth in GPUs didn't really knock FPGAs back. And in fact, there are categories of AI, particularly in inference, where FPGAs continue to be strong. So we're seeing we're actually seeing growth of FPGAs in these HPC and AI types of markets.
And a good point for that.
Per node, that's also been trending up. We're measuring that, and the other things that we're surveying for, we couldn't put everything into the survey. Gosh, I'd like to get into like Cerebras and that big, large wafer scale thing. They just don't have enough market presence yet to really do a meaningful survey on it.
However,
that doesn't mean people
Cerebras was called out by one of our respondents in the qualitative side. The other thing I would mention about FPGAs is the fact that they can be programmed with C++ now. And other popular languages. You don't have to go old school on them.
Well, sure. A big thing that held Starbridge back was no one wanted to learn Viva, right?
Yeah.
So, but as NVIDIA did with CUDA, with GPUs, making them easier to program, being able to bring C++ to an FPGA certainly makes life a lot easier, and we're seeing the maturation of that. And yes, accelerators per node trending up. We're looking at that in particular with the heavier configurations, more GPUs to do a mixed HPC and AI workload. Another thing that's on our radar but not really reflected here is the extent to which we're seeing specialized chips that are pushing out to edge computing, not only for inference at the edge, but I'm hearing people talk about training at the edge now, which is really a very new kind of model. Now, you do training primarily on your main data set, then push it to the edge, but to the extent that you have ongoing refinement or deep learning, we're seeing more training at the edge as well, and that's a trend that we'll continue to talk about here.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a really interesting question we put together to measure how particular combinations appeal to people. What are you impressed by, right? And starting from the top left down, of course, CPU only systems, 90% of the people are at least not unimpressed by those. 50% are impressed. GPU accelerators in general scored the highest at about 67% of people being either very impressed or impressed. FPGAs a little less, but I think that the news of what FPGAs can do and how they're much easier to program needs to get out there. And I think we would see these numbers come up. The
Well,
biggest,
you're seeing 25% of the
yeah,
market impressed by FPGAs, right?
yeah,
That's not nothing.
that's not nothing. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. But it's not GPU-esque yet.
Sure.
And it has a chance for that, I think, down the road. Biggest combination that people are very impressed by is Xeon CPUs, Intel Xeon CPUs with NVIDIA GPUs. I mean, that is the predominant model out there. They're also very impressed with AMD CPUs with the NVIDIA GPUs, which is just a testament to the growing power of AMD in the market. Trailing a little bit is ARM CPUs with NVIDIA GPUs. The AMD Instinct GPU value proposition hasn't really got out there yet. I don't think there's been enough comparative benchmarking done to really show what those AMD GPUs can do. And then the next to the bottom, the Intel Xeon CPUs with the Xeon Xe HPC accelerator, that's pretty high interest, and people are pretty impressed for a product that hasn't been released yet. Don't
Yeah,
you
this
think?
is really consistent with
Yeah.
what we saw in the user ratings survey that was a quarter before this, where we had an entire module on end users' ratings of different processors, how they scored the technical impressions, the operational impressions, the future-looking impressions for all of these different uh, processing elements and vendors. And what we found in that survey a quarter ago was that what the market was really saying they wanted most was the x86 CPUs, either Xeon or AMD EPYC, together with the NVIDIA GPUs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the dominant thing that we're seeing in the market here. But that's not the way the market is evolving, because Intel is coming out with its own accelerator. AMD has its own GPU. NVIDIA is now acquiring ARM. So it's worthwhile to look at what are the impressions of an all ARM plus NVIDIA, and all AMD plus AMD, and all Intel Xeon plus Intel Xe. And those, clearly are trailing, and there's not a lot to distinguish. I mean, sure, you can look at it and say, all right, ARM CPU plus NVIDIA GPU is the highest of those three on this chart. But I mean, I don't know, it's awfully close between those three for a game that's not really engaged yet, when you consider that the majority of the market right now is on the x86 plus NVIDIA train. So that's going to be the dynamic to watch this year, and especially next year, as a lot of these product combinations start to mature.
And let me throw in one thing. I'm reading the chat as it goes by because I'm riddled with ADD, but not responding to all that. Somebody asked a question, were the respondents asked to pick only one? No, each respondent rated each one of these options with how impressed or unimpressed or neutral they were.
Right, scale of 1 to 5. 5 is
Yeah.
very impressed, down to 1 is very unimpressed, and you're seeing the array of scores going on here.
And every respondent weighed in on every one of these.
Well, I guess there are some respondents could leave one blank, but
not when I make a question mandatory, Addison, it's mandatory. It's not just a suggestion, it's the law. You do not go any farther past that in the survey unless you answer every damn one.
Good to know.
Yeah. These are some of the qualitative comments on accelerators that we found very interesting. We had a fair amount of qualitative input on this one. This first one is, handling very large amounts of streaming data, and they need more bandwidth into the GPU, which I think is a very common need out there. And follow that up with the next one, just usage is insatiable. And this survey respondent is not sure if 80 gigabyte memory is really going to help them, but they're very interested to see what's coming out of AMD with the MI100. And the last one is using the Xilinx Vertex 6 FPGAs to do probably digital signal processing and I guess correlation with that. And it's something that we will provide all of the qualitative comments as well to folks that get the entire survey.
Yeah, that middle one is a great indicative quote from someone who's doing that kind of mixed workload environment,
Mm-hmm.
both HPC and machine learning. And that's something that we continue to survey, not only here, but our upcoming budget map survey that we'll talk about shortly will continue to dig into what's the overlap between machine learning and high performance computing. Where is it the same? Where is it different? We'll come back to that on a later slide.
Excellent stuff. Let's talk about some storage. Total active HPC storage. There is a lot of it out there. And again, skipping to the end, in quanting this out, the survey represents roughly 25 exabytes worth of active storage. We had 39% of our folks out there saying that they had, or 2% saying they had more than 1 exabyte, 39% or 19%, 11 to 100 petabytes. There's, again, a lot of storage out there. And
I look at these numbers and how they change year after year, and I remember when a terabyte was a lot of storage.
I do too.
I remember when a petabyte was a lot of storage for
Uh-huh.
sure. And 2/3 of our respondents here are over a petabyte of active data, not archive data, over a petabyte of active data. And we get some in here, I mean, a reasonable number that are already over an exabyte of active data.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
So we drilled down pretty deeply into the storage, and this is an interesting slide. It's showing that on-node flash in the guise of NVMe and SSDs is on par with on-node disk in terms of widespread use, which we knew it was going to happen. I just wasn't sure it would happen this soon.
I actually was surprised that on-node hard disks did as well as they did in this
Really?
survey, and I want to look at this data a little more closely myself and see if some of those hard disks are miscategorized flash arrays. What hard disks were very common as local storage when clusters were brand new. Mm-hmm. You would use them as scratch, and then they largely went away. You went to diskless nodes. And then it's starting to come back again with the different types of flash options. But with regard to storage in general here, what we really did was break down the methodology more into what's on node and flash and what's on node and hard disk. And then the next slide, the separate storage arrays and what do they look like, and then not presented here, the archives as well. And cloud storage. So we took a look at all of that, but let me kick it back to you for the storage arrays.
Yeah, and traditional hard drives are still the predominant choice, but NVMe, flash disk hybrids are on the way up. I would tend to see that as NVMe and SSD prices are coming down, and they are, that I would expect to see them overtake the hybrids. I think the hybrids are not necessarily great answers.
Yeah, I moderated a panel on storage tiering back at SC20 with a lot of the storage vendors, as well as Glenn Lockwood from NERSC, and just got a lot of great insight. Now, people were saying, sure, flash is great in terms of performance. We'd love to have all flash, but it's just too expensive.
Yes.
And go back to what we were just talking about in terms of how much storage there is and what % of the market is up in the petabytes level. If you're talking about buying that much flash, today, it's still economically infeasible.
No, but I can see more of a tiering with all flash arrays as opposed to flash disk hybrid arrays. That active tier is going to be an NVMe SSD array, and then hard drives will be relegated to a tier below that.
And this is an area where, you've said a couple of times, Dan, that we've got all the segmentation on this. And this is an area where it's maybe the most important for our clients who are interested in this space in high-end storage, that we can take a look at what the storage configurations look like for large systems versus small systems, for government versus academia versus commercial, and even to a certain extent with vertical markets within that, to get an idea of what the different types of storage configurations look like at a detailed level. That's what we're really driving at here for our client insights.
Yes. So this is new. We kicked this around between us a lot in trying to get the exact wording to cover all of the permutations of this. And these are the questions we asked. We purchased storage at the same time as servers and from the same vendor, and they rated that as always, usually, not sure, sometimes never. And then the same thing for we purchased storage at the same time as a server, but from a different vendor, or storage is a separate purchase, or a different part of our organization purchases storage and then allocates it, or we predominantly use cloud storage. And this has yielded some really interesting results.
Yeah, this gives us quantitative data to back up something that we've been saying in terms of our storage market in HPC for a long time, where, you know, when we do a survey on high performance storage, the vendors that do specific high performance storage like DDN and Panasys and VAST, you know, they do very well in the surveys. But then, you know, Cumulo is in there also. There's a lot of them. So I hate to start naming them because then I leave people out.
Use somebody out and they're all mad. Yeah.
Enterprise brands like EMC and NetApp and, you know, other HPE storage, you know, start doing really well in terms of revenue. Yeah, they're in the survey, they do well in the survey, but from a revenue perspective, there's just so much of the revenue that has to be accounted for by enterprise storage that doesn't specifically target HPC, but gets used for and paid for by HPC budgets. And we're trying to get a more quantitative look at how and when that happens to justify or change these market models. We've been saying this for a long time. It's time to see if we can do a survey that can actually back that up, or do we need to change our model somewhere? So stand by. HPC Guru always likes to fight with me about this. So now I've got to, I know HPC Guru is going to hear this. Now I've got a survey and we're going to come back to the market with it.
Got some data. Data is king. We don't have to like it, but we have to bow to it. So we also went into parallel file systems, looking at Lustre in this and looking at IBM Spectrum Scale. Lustre is still, of course, on top, although there is a significant number of folks that aren't using it at all. But in terms of broad usage, they top Spectrum Scale by a fair amount. They're kind of at the cool kids table, I guess, would be a way to put it. Commercial HPC market does still lag the public sector in looking at parallel file adoption. We also took a look at Panasys, we looked at Ceph, we looked at B and Weka to see what they're looking at. And also we asked about future use for this.
Yeah, this is, you know, we keep asking about this. Parallel file systems are still not well adopted in commercial markets outside of oil and gas. Oil and gas is the one segment, and actually PanFS does well there. That's the one segment of the market where we see PanFS. But in general, those four that are in the also mentioned category there just do not have anything near the adoption of Lustre or GPFS or Spectrum Scale, I should say. And this is a decline from where Spectrum Scale was. IBM continues to do better in storage than they do in servers and processors, as they've done for the last couple of years. But it's got to where now the decline in IBM power from a server perspective has been an anchor on their storage presence, and
it's starting to hurt.
Storage is starting to fall back as well.
Yes, yes. So clouds, public cloud usage for HPC, very nice pie graph here. 2/3 are using some cloud, some public cloud in some way, but typically it's a a small minority of those that are using it a lot. Only 12% use the public cloud for more than a third of their total HPC. Pretty small number. Now, is this going to change? Absolutely. And we have forecast that the cloud market is burgeoning and will continue to grow. But if you look at the numbers today, it's pretty low adoption, or actually it's broad use. 2/3 are using it, but they're just not using it for much.
Yeah, these are hybrid cloud environments that are still predominantly used for cloud bursting. And that implies that if I can fill the capacity to a high degree of utilization, the HPC market still prefers to go on premises with it. Now, we do see a big cloud support arena with a lot of the managed services providers in this space, or smaller cloud providers. AWS, Azure, GCP continue to do well, and we'll touch that in another slide. But the idea that cloud is dominating HPC continues to be misplaced.
Yeah.
It's getting to where it's not everywhere yet, but it's still very common. And it's not like this is new, that it just popped to 2/3 all of a sudden. I think it first crossed 50% in our surveys in 2017. That was when it really went into high growth mode. We've got it as double-digit growth. We think 2020 was a big year for cloud, where it was a smaller year for everything else, because cloud computing does well with uncertainty. And one thing the pandemic gave us was a lot of uncertainty. So as people slowed down or constrained other types of on-premises purchases, cloud did very well, filling in a lot of gaps. So we're going to see a big cloud year in 2020. But we keep trying to be realistic about cloud in terms of its overall revenue share of high performance computing. We survey this a lot of ways from a lot of different directions, and we're going to touch it again in the budget survey that'll drop later this month.
Excellent. So of the folks that are using cloud, who are the top HPC cloud providers? Amazon is still ruling the roost, with Azure and Google trailing behind, but they are very close.
Yeah, quick note on how to read this slide.
Yes.
It's confusing. When you see 8% all under AWS, that doesn't mean all of my HPC. That means all of my cloud HPC. Of the part that I'm doing, so all the people who said they do some cloud, great. Now, out of how much HPC you're doing in the cloud, who are the vendors? I just wanted to set that up. Back to you, Dan.
And one of the points that make on this slide and the other slide is that there's an economic factor here too. If you're doing all of your HPC compute in the cloud, that is going to be a big monthly check that you're going to write, much bigger than if you were doing it all on-prem. That's assuming that you're taking that capacity and using it 24/7 by 365. So there's going to be an economic limit on this as well. Now, we took a look at other HPC cloud providers, Oracle, IBM, Alibaba. They're well behind the leaders, but we do have data on them. They do have their work cut out for them to catch up. But right now, the big three, go ahead.
Alibaba Cloud does well regionally, right? When we get China respondents, that's where we see it, but then they're just not used outside of that.
Not at all. I would say zero use outside of China, from what we've seen in the data. So effective COVID-19 on HPC environments, I think that this is the best research that's been done on this. And coincidentally, we did it. Surprise. But anyway, so has COVID-19 affected your HPC operations? 56% are saying no, which is, to me, I expected that number to be a bit lower, and the number of folks saying yes, it has, to be a little bit higher. But this is good to know. This is authoritative. Has it impacted your budget? 33% yes, 62% no. And 1/3 of the respondents are reporting that it did affect their budget, exactly 1/3. So let's see how. This is really interesting and compelling stuff to me. The budget has been impacted primarily negatively. 69% reported reductions, but 28% reported increases of, typically around 5 to 10%, a little north of that. So that's interesting. And then
Yeah, this is just critical data, and we're going
it
to touch
is.
this again in the budget survey coming up, which I keep mentioning that's a big influencer in our annual market model. But just looking at, where is it down and where is it up? Now, this is consistent with the notional concepts of how we built our forecast last year
Yes.
when we did the COVID-19 forecast, and I'll come back to that again in a second. If anything, it's more bifurcated than we thought. There are, we said there are going to be sites that increase their budget. There are probably more of those in a greater effect than I thought there would be, but then there's also more that are down and further down than I thought there would be. And that's
And still a lot of
really,
uncertainty.
well, I think it's really because it's lasted as long as it has.
Yes.
When we came out in July with that revised forecast, we were saying our presumption is that the economic effects are going to be constrained to the year 2020. We're now into 2021, and it hasn't, the economic effects are still there. If it doesn't end relatively soon from an economic perspective, regardless of vaccination rates and how we live our day-to-day lives and whether kids go back to school, I'm talking about the economic effects of COVID-19 and how they translate down to HPC. If that doesn't wrap up soon, then it's going to start spilling over into another year of
another fiscal year. Yeah.
on the forecast. And that's what we want to look at here.
Yes. But let's pay it off with this slide. What has COVID-19 done to HPC procurement? Of the 33% that had COVID impact their budgets, a surprising 32%, at least to me, says created new projects and unexpected spending. 13% accelerated their purchases, 35% said no change, 43% paid their purchases, and an interesting, very interesting number to me, and much lower than I thought this could be, 13% canceled their HPC purchases.
Right. Now, that's not 13% of everyone in HPC. It's 13% of the 33%.
Of the 33%.
So you get to a third of 13, you're down around 4% of the market. And
yes.
I think a lot of that happened in academia. So,
yes.
those are a little overrepresented in the survey. So it's not like 4% really off the top went away, but still, that's there. Now, when we redid this forecast, we said, and we, in fact, did a whole webinar around this, the predominant effect is going to be a delay in purchases, not cancellation of purchases. And that's why we expect to have a big rebound year as the sales cycles come back in. So this is all, I would say, still really consistent with how we did our forecast. And that's where we're going to jump into next.
Yes, and I think that's a very telling slide to sum up the impact. Go ahead.
This is the forecast that we put out last July, and we have a whole separate webinar around this, and I'm not going to redo that whole webinar now. There's not time. But we were looking at 2020. This is still forecast for 2020, not actual 2020. This is going, I have to be very clear about this. This is going back to last July. What we were forecasting for complete year 2020, and then the resulting rest of the 5-year forecast. That what we have is predominantly sales get delayed from COVID-19 in 2020, and then in 2021, assuming we resume normal economic activity, the sales cycles come back in, and then you see a spike that's over the curve because you essentially capture extra sales because you get the ones you would have had this year plus some that were delayed from last year. And this commercial vertical market model was our primary model for doing the forecasting, because we were really looking at the different economic effects in each of these vertical markets. The hardest hit ones that we were forecasting that I would stand by: energy, oil and gas in this space has still been suffering from low price of oil. I think they had a huge economic effect of people not flying, people not driving. There's a lot that goes into the energy sector. Retail, this traditional retail, things like analytics, a lot of the online retail really gets captured in the hyperscale market, not the HPC market. And traditional retail was well off in 2020. And then finally, large product manufacturing, your automotive and aerospace industries both had slowdowns in 2020, and those are going to be captured here. Based on our newest data, we were already saying biosciences were going to have an up year. I think they did even better than we were forecasting here. Just taking a quick look at the data and the number of projects that were accelerated, the number of HPC resources that were brought to bear, and the lingering length of this pandemic and the amount of research that we need to do, bioscience is probably going to come in above what we had forecast here. Conversely, academia looking like they're worse than we had forecast. We had forecast academia as one of the more stable vertical markets that we didn't think was going to be as affected by COVID-19. The big thing that changed that, in my analyst opinion, is when we got into the fall, people weren't going back on campus for a lot of research. Yes. That changed a lot of the economic models for a lot of universities, even though they're primarily driven by grants and endowments. People paying tuition isn't nothing, right? And you start losing a lot of that money, and or people not moving on campus, and it really affected the academic market. That's going to come in below what we had forecast in 2020. Overall, this model is looking pretty good from the data we have so far. We're definitely not ready yet to call it on 2020. We've got a lot of work to do on this to remodel it. But in general, the shape of this is still what I think our clients should expect.
I would agree. I think that we'll have to remodel 2021 as well. And that bulge may work itself out to latter 2021 or early 2022, but it just depends. It's all up in the air now because of vaccines and herd, I want to say herd migration, but herd immunity is actually the word I'm looking for. But I still think we're looking at a largish upswing as things become normal again.
Absolutely. And that's going to be a big thing for us to work out. So that'll be the next webinar you see from us prior to ISC. We'll be able to dig into the new market model and forecast in more detail. Okay, another big area we're going to continue to look at is what we were describing as this cloud-like area. During one of our previous webinars, we had talked about, cloud growing double digit. This is 2019 over 2018, highlighting that 17.8% growth. This is an exact slide out of that whole webinar if you want to go back and watch the recording of what we were talking about here. But that $1.4 billion in that cloud category in 2019 is really undercounting the complete effect of cloud, because we were also seeing what we were calling cloud-like areas showing up in other parts of the budget: services, other, software, other, showing up in these other areas. And here's just the roll-up slide, because we don't have time to redo that module of this webinar here, and we've already recorded it. But when people are recording SaaS in their software budgets under software other, there's another $200 to $400 million there. When people are going through companies like Nimbix and Rescale or XISS, Uber Cloud, some R systems, and they're calling it cloud managed services, but putting it in the services budget rather than the cloud budget, there's another $200 to $400 million. You get other things like facilities outsourcing that can show up in other budgets, or just, I don't know where to put this, it's not well described. Overall, we're looking at about $2.5 billion total, or an additional billion on top of what we were directly measuring on that cloud line. This is not adding $1 billion top line to the market, which I know another analyst did, but rather finding it in areas that we were already counting. This is when your methodology works and you find a new trend show up in other first, and then it informs how to change the survey methodology. Additionally, in case we have any of the cloud people on this call, there's definitely some AI in the cloud that for many organizations is entirely separate from any notion of HPC usage or budget. And if I'm only doing machine learning in the cloud, that's showing up if you're a cloud provider as being, well, this is part of HPC. But it's not really part of anyone's HPC budget. I don't know that we want to throw it into the HPC market. Right now it shows up in hyperscale. But if you're a cloud provider and you want to count that as part of HPC in the cloud, well, there's probably another $1 billion there. And that's been described in other surveys where we describe the hyperscale market. So this HPC in the cloud rolls up really to $2.5 billion. And then we're looking at if you cloud native non-HPC machine learning training is higher still. This is what we're going to really drill down in in more detail in our newest budget map survey. We found out from our last survey there's some other areas we need to refine the methodology on. That's what you're going to be seeing next from us, this new budget map survey. And Dan and I are knocking heads right now on tweaking the final questions on how do we want to look at SaaS and cloud managed services and facilities outsourcing. How do we count that in the budget, and how do we roll it into the new total market model? That's in addition to all of the normal questions we have on budget allocations and trends. This is the critical guidance for our HPC market model and forecast. In addition to that, we continue to look at the interrelationship between HPC and machine learning. Is that same budget, different budget, same people, different people, same hardware, different hardware? This is something that we're going to just continue to look at in this next survey.
And that's going to tell the story as we focus in
for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
So that survey is about to hit the field. That'll be open for client inquiry based on the data. Hopefully in April, we'll have that cleaned, and I'll be able to send all those to you, Dan. You can answer all of our clients' questions.
Yay. That'll be great.
And we'll ultimately have a revised HPC market model and forecast, including ongoing effects of COVID-19, targeting releasing that in May 2021. Look for us to have a webinar possibly in early June, as yet to be announced, prior to ISC, where we'll be able to look at that revised HPC market model and forecast, and also set up for ISC. In the meantime, where we'll be next, and we'll see you there. The Rice University Oil and Gas Conference is this week on March 5th, with workshops going on for a couple of weeks. Beyond that, I really love this conference, and I like calling it out because that, Dan, is the last HPC event I was at in person.
Really? Okay. Okay.
When you go to register and you see the promo shot, you'll see me in the middle there. I'm sitting down front and center like a big nerd, because that's a great place to get pictures of that I can put on Twitter, take notes from. It's going to be a little different this year, but we're coming up on officially a year of no travel. That'll be followed closely by one of our favorites, Dan, the HPC AI Advisory
Stanford Council. Stanford Conference, yes.
The nominal Stanford event, although it's virtual, online still. That's March 17th and 18th. We'll be at that. There are probably a couple of other events in between, but definitely want to highlight end of next quarter, ISC High Performance 2021. Sorry, we won't be in Germany. It's always fun to be there.
Yeah.
Dan, we were talking before about the vendor showdowns. That's going to take a different format this year because of the virtual events, and it's going to be a series of panels that I'll get to moderate with the vendor sponsors, just a different format. But then those hot seat sessions, they'll probably come back when we get back in.
Yeah, I think they'll be the same. But well, I mean, we did it last year virtually too.
And with that, we are right on time. Sign up for
Yeah.
our newsletters, answer surveys, stay abreast of our research, get on our newsletters, find our podcast, This Week in HPC, SoundCloud, iTunes, and of course, become a client. There's a bunch of links there. Furthermore, you can find Dan Olds on Twitter at Dan Olds. You can email him, dan@intersect360.com. And we've got some time left in this webinar. Dan, what do you say we take some Q&A?
Let's do it. What do we got? I've been seeing a pretty active chat going and kind of reading them as I could.
Well, Amy is here feeding them to me. Dan mentioned access to data. How do we access the full data set? Well, that's fun. You can buy it. You can be a client of Intersect 360 Research. Send us a note, and then we can sell you the full data set. If you are in academia and need academic citation for some report that you're working on, our website also has links for academic citation. We can set that up for you. If you're another type of end user and willing to participate in our surveys, we'll often do some kind of deal for you where you give some data and get some data. But other than that, we invite you to become a subscriber.
Looking at the question deck, we've got a lot of them.
In the spirit of International Women's Month and a commitment to changing unequal ratios, is there any data collected on who these folks are with regard to self-identification, in regards to individuals who identify with regard to gender and sexual orientation? Just want to make sure we're also who the admins and decision makers are in the room with regard to budget in AI HPC. You know what? That's a good idea, and we've never done it.
We could do that.
We have never collected data on gender, sexual orientation, race in regards to those surveys. And I will just acknowledge, here we are, two white guys sitting and talking about it, Dan.
Speak for yourself. Speak for yourself, Addison.
Well, you know, it's something that you and I have each individually tried to promote inclusion in HPC. We did a big panel last year on racial inclusion in HPC. It's something you've worked on through the student cluster competition. And it's something that we would like to use our analyst seats in order to help better the conversation around. So I appreciate the question. I had not considered doing that kind of sampling in our survey, and I'm glad to get the feedback.
It's a simple one question, two question ad that we can do. One of the things that I would point out for all of you, by the way, is that we're not just going out there and throwing these surveys out on the web. We know who each and every respondent is. And
that's a good point. We could
really
probably
important
go
to know.
and identify them, and
we could identify by first name at least. To what extent that does.
Well,
but
a lot of them we can look up too. We
can look them up. That's right.
That's right. Really interesting and good point. We put in NVIDIA to test their perception as a survey vendor, but not Intel. What do you say to that, Dan?
I would say that I didn't really consider putting in Intel because I was afraid that people would see that as we use Intel chips. And
this was kind of a one-time thing to me. I wanted to see it because of the DGX in particular and how much news NVIDIA made recently as a system provider through resellers. If this had been a few years ago, Intel was doing similar with reference architectures and being a server vendor. And we did test that back then. Intel just wasn't in the news the same way this way. And we're not going to be reporting NVIDIA as a server vendor in that same way. But I was interested in user perceptions this time.
Not unless they really start to sell servers directly or through partners. If the DGXs start to pick up more steam, if we start to see other models, because, you know, it's interesting in that they've assembled, if the ARM purchase goes through, which is an open question, they've got all the parts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And something we're going to keep looking at. Now, with regard to Intel, go back to a previous webinar, we are looking at Intel as a storage vendor, by the way. I think Optane is one of the most fascinating products that Intel has in all of HPC, and we are seeing that coming up out in the market. So,
and of course, we'll be tracking their accelerator as well, very closely.
Here's an opinion question, Dan, and I'll give you a crack at it, thinking about NVIDIA, or just in general, is there a shift in computing technology to extreme heterogeneous architectures?
I think there will be. And this is something I predicted back, well, I can go ahead and put whatever date on it because I don't think any of you know or read it, because it was like more than a decade ago, that we're moving towards more of a mainframe type model. And if you're familiar with the mainframe, it has central CPUs, but it has assist processors to offload pretty much anything you can think of off of those CPUs. It's a very efficient model. They have assist processors for encryption, decryption, dedupe, I believe, of course, for IO. They've had that for a long time. I think we're going to see that as a more and more prevalent model. And I would point to, for instance, DPUs from NVIDIA, but also the latest Xilinx FPGA that they just introduced that is DPU-like.
Great answer. Nothing to add. Dan nailed it. I'd be interested on any vendor OEM satisfaction data. It's been difficult for me to get more than a hardware. That was our last survey that we did. Go see previous webinar and talk to me about user preferences. There's a comment. I have a problem with the cluster size and distribution slide. It assumes nodes are all the same size. Yeah. I get it.
It does.
And we've in other surveys, we've looked at SMPs and other things. Absolutely. We don't normally break things down by node like that, but we needed to get something that was at least the distributional shape of the curve. So I understand completely that we're not going to take that as complete data on this is exactly what the market looks like, but it is going to help inform a total model. So difference between analyst opinion and the data there.
Yeah, the other thing that we fight all the time is how long could we make these surveys? And not that long, and to be able to get it down to the point that you're talking about, that's an additional probably 3 or 4 questions. But let me ask you, Addison, 2 nodes or two socket nodes versus 4 socket other socket nodes. I think primarily in HPC we're looking at 95% or 2 socket nodes. 90%?
You're high. That is
a little high, you think?
Node, but it's not 95%. Last I looked, it was, now you're testing me memory of my own data. It was something like in the 80s. And then 4 is more common than 1, but 1 is starting to appear with more regularity than it had before.
Kind of an AI thing.
The vendors going back to 1 socket nodes. Now, you also have to take out the SMP data when you look at that, because there's still a bunch of SMPs in the lower end of the market. So, SMP is by definition 1 node, even if it's a huge shared memory system.
Yeah. Maybe we do that, though, but it's a good tip. Thank you.
Will the slides and recording be available post-event? Yes, recording and slides will be available on our website, intersect360.com presentations. Check back later today. We hope to... intersect360.com/presentations is where you'll be able to find them on our website. Check back, hopefully later today, we'll have them up.
And check daily just for the hell of it. We'll throw different stuff up there.
Do we have data on how the different types of interconnects map to the cluster size bands shown in previous slides? Yes, we can do that. Yep. We can cross-correlate that. Any future, and by the way, the higher speeds tended to go with some of the larger clusters, but also we see differences in Ethernet versus InfiniBand, also by different vertical markets, biosciences, finance, and even the entry level of academia really tend a lot more toward Ethernet. And some of the more engineering types of areas and other vertical markets in HPC will go more toward InfiniBand.
But we can break all that down.
Yeah, we can break it down. Are any future plans to track specialized deep learning accelerator vendors? Depends on what you mean by track. Certainly, we want to be informed about them and give analyst opinion about them. If by track you mean surveys, then we have to get to a point where there's enough of a footprint out there that we can return meaningful data in the survey. Certainly, we could always do a custom survey and target them specifically, but if they're a low percent of the market right now, then that winds up being a much higher cost per survey to go after them. So that's a long way of saying it depends on interest in our client base.
Yeah.
Where interest is a synonym of we get paid to do it.
Yes. And there's something, last time I checked, more than 50 specialized processors out there.
Yeah, with the AI market in particular, it was just
Yeah.
an explode. The last AI hardware summit, it was just presentation after presentation of people with custom silicon going after the AI market, and they're not all going to succeed. It's a hugely competitive space now for something that's a nascent market.
Yes.
Are we beginning to see the decline of general purpose computing and the move to specialized computing given this accelerator discussion and findings? What do you think, Dan? Here's where you might ask two analysts and get two opinions.
Okay. Designing your compute for a workload is always going to be your most efficient route. With having like highly dialed in FPGAs and having a CPU as just a traffic cop, it's always going to be the fastest, most effective, most efficient, maybe not price performant, but it's going to be your highest performance route. Here's the problem, is that when you design like that and deploy like that, you're going to get silos that are only really fit for one or two workloads. And then you have to worry about utilization. Your price performance goes down with every little bit of underutilized capacity. And when you start thinking that way, it makes it tough to justify having that sort of specialized architecture for those applications. And you start to get to a solution that's more generalized, like GPUs and CPUs.
Yep. The way I look at that is, there's a quote I like that's attributed to Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. And you and I, Dan, have been in this industry long enough to look at the long view of trends, one of which to me is a pendulum swing back and forth between general purpose and specialized, general purpose and specialized. And it kind of goes with centralized and decentralized. And the dawn of the Beowulf era for clusters was a pull back from specialized computing into we're just going to go to vanilla clusters and vanilla interconnects, and everything's going to look the same. And the advantage of that is portability. That was the big thing we're sold on. You get it in MPI once, which was a pain in the neck. No one wanted to do it, but you get into MPI and then it's totally portable to all these different areas.
And by the way, Linux came along right after.
Yep. And now the pendulum has swung back hard the other way. And it's been really since the advent of multi-core going into many core, and then the accelerators kept getting added into that. And it's been the pendulum going the other way towards specialization, and it's not portable from one to the next. If I line everything up on this brand of accelerator, then it's not portable to something else. I'm on it. So it's most efficient there, but I can't lift and shift to something else. Cloud computing is an interesting dynamic here. I don't think it means the end of general purpose computing at all. And I think over time in different areas, different architectures get valued differently. I think there is still a big value in general purpose computing. A lot of that gets pulled into cloud right now. You could just say, well, heck, it doesn't matter what it is, I'll run it in the cloud. That puts pressure on the traditional server OEMs. But I appreciate the question because it's something I think you have to look at with a long arc.
Yeah, I don't see GP or general purpose computing going away or going anywhere.
Someone has a comment that they're reminded of the quote misattributed to Henry Ford. If I asked people what they want, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. Well, sure. What you're talking about there is paradigm shift. And that certainly does happen in this industry. And when you get something that's truly new, Yeah, that shakes up paradigms, and it's hard to survey for paradigm shift because people don't know that they want it. The great thing about HPC in general is that it keeps reinventing itself. We don't get to a point where we've reached the end of science. There's going to
Yeah,
be another tougher problem to solve.
faster horse. Love that.
Do we have any old data on historical Knights Landing interest and how that might compare to XE? Um,
Ooh, that's
yes.
interesting. I believe you do, don't you?
We do. I don't remember it, but you know that it's the point is well made that that there have been different commitments from Intel in this space with regard to Dan, you were talking to me just yesterday about Larrabee
And son of Larrabee and son of Larrabee. This
right.
time it's personal. Yeah.
So now we're back around to Intel XE. I will say, in terms of what I'll say publicly, I'll say for my official analyst opinion is the stakes are high for Intel now on Intel XE and One API.
Yeah.
Because of the false starts and decommitments they've made other places in HPC recently. All eyes are on this XE accelerator now and how it goes into the redefined Aurora supercomputer at Argonne and how it gets deployed in the rest of HPC. It is certainly not too late for Intel to, I mean, you pointed out, Dan, they're in 98% of HPC sites, but AMD is coming up fast and people love NVIDIA accelerators. Intel has to get this one right, or it's going to, I think, my opinion is it's going to start to be a mistake too many for a lot of users.
I agree. Not sure how much to say here. I can just stop there and agree with you. Yeah.
That goes against your constitution.
It does. I am leaning towards them having learned a lot about the mistakes of the past and the misfires. I think this is going to be a lot closer to the target that they need to hit. But I need to see some numbers. We need to get some deeper background on it before we can say anything for sure. Need to see the thing.
Yeah. Next question, will it really happen, NVIDIA acquiring ARM? That is a really tough thing to crystal ball. I mean, if I knew the answer to questions like that, I could be in a different career.
I think I know.
People are already in the comments weighing on. I mean, we could start a betting pool on it. I don't think I have get me offline when I'm not in a recorded webinar and I'll lay odds on it. But I don't have an official analyst opinion on whether that'll happen. Do you, Dan?
I do.
Okay, give it to me.
I'm leaning towards it not happening because it has to be approved by the UK. It's got to be approved by America. It's got to be approved by the EU. And the toughest one, it's got to be approved by China. And the problem I see, and I could be wrong, I'm not a lawyer, although I portray myself as one all the time, but that if NVIDIA buys ARM, ARM becomes an American company. If they're an American company, if ARM is under the umbrella of as an American company, then that becomes under US trade laws. And potentially US trade laws could say, nope, no more ARM to China, which could essentially kill the Chinese cell phone market, for example.
All right, I like that analysis, Dan. And since you came out with an opinion, you convinced me. I'll come out with an opinion. I'll go the other way, and I'll say 7-5 in favor it goes through.
Let's bet a dinner on it.
You got it. That sounds
I mean, good. I could just be talking out of my whatever, but that's kind of the way I see it. I see China saying no.
All right, we got about 10 more minutes. Let's see how many more questions
we can
get here. Is the perception of NVIDIA's performance reflective of actual performance, or is it just perception? To me, that's not something I can measure directly, right? But I would say there's enough actual usage of NVIDIA out there that people should have a well-formed opinion. That's what I think. Dan, how about you?
Same thing. They wouldn't keep buying them if they weren't getting their money's worth out of them. They're not buying these things as tricks anymore, like maybe back in the old days just to try it.
Well, exactly. And that's something we do have data on, is how many accelerators per system and how many accelerators per node are going into these things. And that has been growing. Originally with GPUs, we saw a lot. I mean, keep in mind, it's been more than 10 years now
Yeah.
of this campaign from NVIDIA. The kudos for having a long-term campaign on GPU computing and CUDA. And I think it's relevant that the footprint of the GPUs has been growing, which implies that they start in a trial stage, and as the performance gets proved out for particular workloads, then it starts to expand. Someone makes the comment, on-node storage, costs are the driving factor. Yep, costs are driving factors. I wonder how much of the storage is actually being used and active data. Some of the capacity increase is driven by storage vendors pushing customers to higher capacity drives. Do we agree? I don't know, because the question wasn't asked how much storage do you have. The question was asked how much active data do you have.
Yeah.
I think that so yeah, sure, people are buying more storage than they need, figuring they've got to fill it. But the question that we showed on the chart was how much active data, wasn't it, Dan?
Yes. Yes, that's what we asked.
Do we have any granularity on high performance parallel file systems versus cheap and deep active archive storage? It seems like SSDs and NVMe will grow for high performance file systems, and HDD will eat up more of the active archive market. Yes, we have some granularity on that, but that's such a detailed question and inference you're trying to make that it goes beyond, here's a survey chart that answers exactly that. I mean, that's—
Are you looking for a job?
Yeah, that would be cool. But what you're really getting into is we would have to not only do the data segmentation of that, but then read the data and tell you what we think. Forecasting there's a lot of analyst opinion in it as well. Anything you want to add on that, Dan, or no?
I would just say that to get an answer to that, we would have to give these people a call individually.
How do you buy storage in your survey? That question. Will we provide a cut by cluster size or other client demographic? Well, if you're our client, then we can provide whatever cuts you need. So talk to us about that. Comment or suggestion, moving forward, consider splitting storage market survey questions into high performance and tier 2 or active archive. Would be interesting to tease those apart. Agree. And that you can see that we're leaning toward that now in terms of, looking at how much active data versus archive data, and primary storage and secondary storage, and who's buying it and how. So, we can't if we did an entire deep dive survey just on storage, we could get to that. We have done that in the past. We have to look at, as Dan said before, there's only so much we can get into one survey. So if that's something our clients are interested in us going after, we can do that in more detail. But yes, you've caught us. We are leaning in that direction. I want to measure out how much HPC storage is really intentional high performance storage versus how much is incidental storage that gets used by high performance applications.
What if we ask this question, Addison, that tell us your top 4 tiers of storage, you give them drop downs to pick for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4?
That would be a cool question. We got to figure out where and how we're going to ask that. So, clients, if you're interested in that, who the chief research officer is and who you got to influence in terms of getting questions into another survey. Do you see the impact from academia being mostly from researchers, people who might already be established in their field, or from students? That is not a level of granularity we capture in the survey. So I want to be really careful answering that. I think they're all in there. I don't know.
Primarily to end up on our list, typically not a student thing.
Yeah, but we do get students in there who are the smaller ones that show up in academia, because people like filling out surveys in order to get a $25 Amazon gift card. So there are some of those in there too, and they're good data, and we like having that data in there.
But when you say student,
that at all.
We could be D students.
Yeah, but we have to look
Makes it
at
a bit more
that
serious.
when, you know, a survey comes in from a huge academic center, and we're trying to suss out, all right, is this a site level survey that's getting answered, or is this just an individual user who accesses those resources?
But
Or,
remember our washing process that we went through
oh yeah,
in pulling out the people that seemed to look like they knew what they were doing in the first couple of questions, but then their story falls apart farther in when you realize they don't know the definitions of some of these words.
yeah.
So
Dan and I went through a pretty intense cleaning process like we
yes,
normally do.
scrubby bubbles and bleach and everything.
You said we had how many respondents in the end that you analyzed? 260 some?
Close to 500.
Yeah, but we wound up on
268.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
clean nearly half don't make the cut for final analysis, where it's not that we don't like the data, it's that we don't trust the data. We would rather give our clients 260 data points where we're really confident on, you know, these are good data, than 460 and, you know, close to half of them are
I mean, we're
iffy.
down to arguing about individuals in this, and then we also do some Google searches on the names
Oh yeah,
and go,
we
yeah,
do
this
quite a
one's
lot.
legit. This one, not so much.
We do quite a lot. The data cleaning process is intense from Intersect 360 research. We can take a couple of more here. Have you looked at DOE AI and machine learning use cases and how they feel it fits into the sciences? That's a qualitative question. So sure, we talk to our friends in the DOE, but that's not something in this survey. We said, hey, DOE friends, how do you feel AI and machine learning fits into the sciences? That's not something we addressed in this survey, was it?
No, I've got a little color to add to this though, that I did an HPC road trip back in 2018, and I stopped by 7 different labs in the West. And what I heard from all of them except one is that their path forward is using AI to inform their simulations. That's
Yeah,
6 out of the
that is
7.
something that we projected would be a big use case here, is that linkage of HPC and AI from even from a steering standpoint, computational steering with AI. And that is something I've heard from the labs.
And that's something, if you look up the Dan Olds 2018 HPC road trip, you'll see interviews there that talk about it.
You note that active data storage is growing fast, but where are the improvements above and beyond CPU and GPU to manage all this data? Well, that's
There you
not a
go.
question for us. That's a gripe for the industry.
And we will forward that on to the industry.
Go
We have a
talk to your
call with them
friendly
later on.
storage vendor. Insights into why commercial sites are using more AMD and ARM than public and academic. Yes, my opinion there, and this is opinion more than data, but my opinion is that commercial use cases are more likely to have specific workloads, and therefore they can be tailored to particular architectures, whereas academic labs tend to be more general purpose and have to buy something that's going to make everybody happy. So that means staying on things that are just used by everybody for longer. Dan, any comment?
Ditto.
With with liquid cooling deployments, what was the academic commercial split? I don't remember off the top of my head. Dan, do you?
But you know what? On my handy third screen here, I do have the survey up, and I believe that it was government had more liquid cooling overall.
Sure, in the big labs, probably.
In the big labs. Academics, little less, and industry was kind of behind the curve. At least that's what I'm seeing just with a glance.
So it was more in the public sector, probably but that probably skews toward I don't think the difference is as much in the sector, commercial, academic, government, as it is in the size of the installation.
Yes.
I think the big supercomputing labs are more likely to have liquid cooling, and the smaller ones are less likely to have it. So that would be
That's
my
what we're seeing. Yeah.
opinion on that. Let's see. Let's take one more question. And I'm going to make it be this one. What's your take on quantum computing? Do you think we can see a widespread quantum usage anytime soon, Dan?
What's my take on quantum? It's very complicated. Are we going to see it in the future? I think we're going to have to. Otherwise, we're not going to have any sort of security at all. I think we're going to need quantum to be widespread in order to have any sort of digital security at all.
Yeah, widespread, no, not widespread. I don't think soon, not in our forecast. So, I mean, soon is a nice relative word. I think I'll see it in my career, but I've got time left. But I wouldn't put it into the 5 or even 10-year forecast that we'll see widespread quantum computing usage. I do think that this is an excellent use of cloud. Particularly if you combine it with quantum training services. The company that's really well positioned for this, talk about a company that's always ahead of the curve on things is IBM. IBM Q, with their quantum cloud resources, are really well set up to address commercial use cases of quantum computing. And then all of the other quantum computing providers that are cloud providers that are looking into quantum computing. Cloud is well set up for
that is the model.
Pieces there.
Oops, I kicked out my USB cord. I've fixed that on my camera. But yeah, I agree with that cloud is the model that we will see. But there's a whole world of software that has to catch up to this.
I want to honor everyone's time. We've reached the end of our hour and a half. We have questions still pouring into the chat. So if you've asked a question in chat and we didn't get a chance to get to it on our webinar, we'll do our best to get back to you over email. Dan, I'm sorry you lost your video there for a second, because I was enjoying talking to you and also welcoming you onto the team. That's the biggest news out of everything here. So,
thank you. And I want to thank all the well-wishers that we've had in Twitter and in the chat here. I'm just overwhelmed with the warmth and the welcome, even from my enemies. The voluminous number of people that hate my guts.
Never make it, Dan.
That never made worth anything in this business. But I told them, hey, I can make hundreds of dollars in this business. Just you watch.
I'm glad to have you on board, Dan. Thank you for joining me on this webinar.
Thank you,
everybody who tuned in.
See you soon.